I've always been a traveler, an explorer at heart. The allure of the unknown has always pulled me, beckoning me to venture into the wilderness, to explore the untouched and uncover secrets hidden for centuries. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found in the unexplored forests of North America. It was a place that carried a silence so heavy, so suffocating, that it felt as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. I had heard whispers of these woods from other adventurers who had dared to venture into them, but none of them returned with any concrete stories. Just vague mentions of a strange feeling or a presence. Most dismissed it as superstition, but curiosity drove me forward, always chasing the next great mystery. I spent days trekking through the dense forest, the trees so thick they blocked out much of the sunlight, casting everything in an eerie twilight. The further I went, the heavier the silence became. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, as though the air itself was thick with anticipation. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't the usual sense of awareness that a traveler gets when surrounded by wild animals. This was different. It felt deliberate. At night, I would set up camp, always checking the perimeter for any signs of life. But there was nothing, just the trees and the silence. Still, I could not shake the sense of eyes on me, even when there was no one around. The nights became unbearable, filled with an unnerving tension that had me tossing and turning in my sleeping bag, straining to hear even the slightest sound. But there was only the whisper of the wind through the trees, a sound that didn't seem quite natural. And then on the third night, I started seeing things. At first, it was subtle. A flicker in the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the trees, too quick for me to focus on. But as the days wore on, the sightings grew more frequent, more distinct. Figures tall, almost human, but wrong in every sense. Their forms were hazy, shifting in and out of visibility like they were never meant to be seen. I thought I was just losing my mind, the isolation playing tricks on me. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. The whispers began. It started softly, like a faint murmur carried by the wind, barely audible but unmistakable. As the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to come from every direction. They were words in a language I couldn't understand, spoken in a voice that chilled my bones. Sometimes they would call my name, but when I turned to look, there was no one there. It was as if the very forest was alive, speaking to me, trying to lure me deeper into its heart. I began to feel the marks on my body. Small, almost imperceptible at first, like the scratch of a thorn or a brush against rough bark. But they weren't from the environment. These marks were deliberate, as if someone had touched me. Each day, new ones appeared. I didn't know if I was doing it to myself in my delirium, or if something else was leaving them behind. But it wasn't just my body that was changing. I started to have dreams, vivid, disturbing dreams. Dreams of being chased through the forest by something that never fully revealed itself. In these dreams, I would wake up, only to find that I was still in the forest, still being pursued. The line between dream and reality blurred, and I couldn't tell if I was still asleep or if the nightmare had become my waking life. I knew I had to leave, but when I attempted to turn back, the forest seemed to shift, the trails I had followed now leading me in circles. The trees closed in around me, as if trying to trap me. I couldn't find my way out. I don't know how much time passed, but I was lost, both physically and mentally. Every path felt wrong, every turn an illusion. When I finally stumbled out of the forest, my body was covered in strange, painful scratches, and my mind was fractured, filled with those haunting whispers that still echoed in my head. I had escaped, but not unscathed. As I stepped into the clearing, I thought I saw something move at the edge of my vision. A shadow, watching, waiting. I thought I had outrun whatever it was, but the truth is, I hadn't. Whatever had been following me in that forest, it came back with me. At night, I feel it, its presence looming just beyond my reach, like a dark weight pressing against my chest. Sometimes, in the quiet of my room, I hear those whispers again, but this time, they're not carried by the wind. They're right beside me, just out of sight. I thought I was free, but now I know that I never will be. That thing, whatever it is, still wants me, and it's patient. It's waiting for me to return, to bring me back into the darkness. And if I do, I fear it will take me for good. The forest I ventured into wasn't just any uncharted wilderness. It was a land steeped in mystery, a place so ancient that even the air felt thick with history and forgotten secrets. The trees towered above me, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, creating an almost suffocating canopy that blocked out most of the sun. Beneath the trees, the ground was soft and uneven, each step sinking slightly into the thick layers of moss and dead leaves. As the days passed, the world around me began to feel unreal, as though I had stumbled into a place where the rules of nature no longer applied. In the silence of the forest, the sense of isolation grew heavier. The deeper I went, the more I realized that this wasn't just any place on Earth. This was somewhere forgotten by time itself, a space outside the normal bounds of reality. No one had marked the territory on any maps, and the locals avoided speaking about it. There were no legends, no stories, just an ominous silence that made even the bravest turn away. My name is Liam, and though I've always been a traveler and explorer, there was something about this place that made even me hesitate. But curiosity, that ever-present drive to uncover the unknown, pushed me onward. I had always prided myself on being grounded, logical, and dismissive of superstition. The whispers of the woods were nothing more than stories told to scare the foolish. Or so I believed. I wasn't foolish, but I was naive. The world inside the forest wasn't just alien. It was living, breathing, almost sentient. With every step I took, the woods seemed to adapt to my movements, shifting and changing, as though the trees themselves were watching me. It wasn't just the wildlife that seemed unnervingly aware of my presence. It was the very land beneath my feet. At times, I thought I could hear the earth itself groaning in response to my intrusion. I felt as if I was being drawn deeper into its dark heart. My companions, geologists from various backgrounds, weren't like me. They were more skeptical, focused on the scientific rather than the spiritual aspects of the world. But even they had begun to feel the unease. They tried to brush off their discomfort as we continued, rationalizing the shadows and odd sounds we'd been hearing as nothing more than tricks of the mind, a product of overexposure to the wild. But none of us could explain the persistent feeling of being followed, the constant sense that something, or someone, was just out of sight. The first sign that we were dealing with something beyond our comprehension came on the third night. As usual, we gathered around the campfire, each of us trying to hide our growing sense of unease behind forced smiles and casual chatter. But something was different this time. The wind had died down completely, and for the first time in days, the forest was completely still. Even the usual hum of insects and rustling leaves was absent. It was as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath in anticipation. That's when I saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of the campfire's glow. It was too fast to be an animal, too deliberate to be the wind. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but as the night wore on, I wasn't the only one who saw it. The others began to notice as well. A shadow moving between the trees, just outside the firelight, always just out of reach, but never truly gone. At first, we rationalized it. It's probably just a large animal, one of the geologists suggested. But there was no sound of footsteps, no rustling of leaves as something large should have made. And it wasn't just one shadow. The movement seemed to come from several different directions, as if something or someone was circling us. The next day, we found the first signs of trouble. One of the geologists, Sarah, had disappeared overnight. Her tent was still set up, her equipment untouched. It was as though she had simply vanished into thin air. Panic set in, but we convinced ourselves that she must have wandered off in her sleep. Perhaps she'd gotten lost or had some kind of accident. We searched for hours, calling her name, but there was no sign of her anywhere. And yet, the forest seemed to grow colder, more oppressive. We couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong in a way that defied explanation. As the days stretched on, the remaining geologists became more and more distant. Their fear was palpable, their rational minds unable to comprehend the terror creeping into our midst. I tried to reassure them, to maintain our purpose, but deep down, I knew I wasn't just dealing with an isolated incident. Whatever was happening in these woods, it was not of this world. And then, I began to feel it in my own body. The marks. I had dismissed them at first, small scratches that could have been from the dense brush or a thistle. But the scratches grew, deepened, and multiplied. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, more suffocating. My dreams, too, turned darker. The shadows in my dreams felt real, as if they were trying to reach through the layers of sleep and drag me into the depths of their domain. It was impossible to ignore any longer. Whatever was in the forest with us, whatever force had been stalking us, was not simply a trick of the mind. It was something more, a presence, a power that had been in these woods long before we ever set foot there. Something ancient, something that did not welcome our intrusion. We were intruders, and the forest, it seemed, had decided to remind us of that in the most horrific way possible. As the days passed, we began to unravel the horrifying truth. This was no ordinary forest. The whispers in the trees were not the wind. The shadows we saw were not mere illusions. And the marks on our bodies were not self-inflicted. We had entered the domain of something far older and more dangerous than we could comprehend. In the end, it was not just the forest that haunted us. It was the realization that we were not meant to leave. The shadows were always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment when we would become part of the forest's twisted history. As the days dragged on, the sense of unease grew exponentially. The forest, which had initially seemed like a vast, untamed wilderness, now felt like a living, breathing entity. The very air felt thick and oppressive, and the deeper we ventured into the woods, the more I felt as though the trees were closing in on us. It wasn't just the unnerving silence that weighed on us. It was something more sinister, something we couldn't explain. We were no longer just explorers. We were trespassers. The first real shift came when Sarah disappeared. We woke up to find her gone, her tent undisturbed, her gear untouched. It made no sense. Sarah had been one of the most reliable in the group, always meticulous about keeping her things in order. Her sudden absence threw us into a state of panic. At first, we searched the camp and its surroundings, thinking she had wandered off in the night. But the deeper we searched, the less sense everything made. It was as if she had evaporated into the air, vanished without a trace. We rationalized it at first. Maybe she had wandered off accidentally, or maybe she had been kidnapped by an animal. But there were no signs of struggle, no marks on the ground. Just an eerie, disquieting stillness. It was as though the forest itself had swallowed her up. The trees, the very earth beneath us, seemed to mock our frantic efforts to make sense of what had happened. The more we searched, the more the woods seemed to tighten around us, suffocating any shred of hope we had of finding her. The rest of the group started to grow tense, their initial skepticism fading in the face of Sarah's unexplained disappearance. The once jovial atmosphere that had characterized our expedition turned into something much darker. We no longer sat around the campfire telling stories or planning our next move. We were on edge, constantly scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, any noise that might signal danger. It was impossible to shake the feeling that something was watching us. That feeling intensified with every passing hour, every step further into the woods. It wasn't just the oppressive silence that had become unnerving. It was the subtle presence of something else, something that defied explanation. I had grown up in the wild, spent my entire life exploring the most remote corners of the earth, but nothing had prepared me for this. One night, the tension reached a boiling point. We had all gathered around the fire, silently staring into the flames, each lost in our own thoughts, when we heard the first sound that didn't belong. A low, guttural growl, coming from the darkness just beyond our campsite. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't the growl of a bear or the rumble of a large cat. It was deeper, more resonant, and somehow more human. At first, we all froze, hoping that it was just a trick of the wind or some animal lurking in the distance. But then it came again, closer this time, a growl that vibrated through the air and sent a chill crawling up my spine. I couldn't see anything in the shadows, but the growl was unmistakable. It was as if whatever was out there was trying to warn us, or maybe it was trying to lure us in. We gathered our gear quickly, our attempts to remain calm now shattered. The reality of our situation set in like a ton of bricks. We weren't safe. We weren't alone. And whatever was lurking in the forest with us wasn't just some wild animal. It was something far more dangerous. The next day, as we ventured deeper into the woods, we found signs of Sarah. At least, we thought it was her. We came across a patch of ground where the earth was disturbed, as though something had been dragged through the leaves. The marks seemed fresh, and they led us toward a small clearing. There, in the center, was a pile of torn clothing, ripped to shreds, but there was no body. Just the remnants of her, as though whatever had taken her had discarded her clothes and left behind only the faintest trace of her presence. The discovery sent us into a frantic state of panic. It wasn't just the disappearance of Sarah that had us on edge. It was the feeling that whatever had claimed her wasn't finished. It wasn't just hunting. It was toying with us, waiting for us to fall into its trap. We couldn't escape the feeling that every move we made was being watched. Every step we took was being calculated by something far more intelligent and far more patient than we were. As the days wore on, our situation grew worse. The wildlife around us grew increasingly hostile. We began to hear the sounds of creatures moving just out of sight, their movements too deliberate to be random. There were no signs of animals, no tracks, no droppings, but the sounds were unmistakable. Whatever was in the forest, whatever was stalking us, was not of this world. It was something that thrived in the shadows, something that could move through the trees without leaving a trace. My companions' nerves were fraying. They were starting to crack under the pressure, their once calm demeanor replaced by fear and paranoia. It was no longer just about finding Sarah. It was about surviving, getting out of the forest alive. But the deeper we ventured, the more we realized that escape wasn't an option. Whatever was in these woods had no intention of letting us leave. We were no longer hunters in the wild. We were the hunted, and whatever was out there was closing in on us, step by calculated step. Every crack of a twig, every whisper of wind made our hearts race. We were not just lost in the forest. We were trapped in a nightmare, and there was no waking up from it. As the tension within the group escalated, so did the complexity of our situation. At first, we had set out with a shared goal, each of us eager to uncover the mysteries of this uncharted forest. However, as the days passed, the cracks in our unity began to show. What started as an adventure had become a survival story, and survival often brings out the worst in people. One of the first signs that our group was fracturing was when Jake, one of my fellow explorers, began to act strangely. At first, it was subtle, his quiet demeanor growing quieter, his eyes darting nervously around the camp at night, always glancing into the forest as though expecting something to emerge. But then it got worse. Jake started having fits of paranoia, convinced that one of us was hiding something, that Sarah's disappearance wasn't just the work of some unseen force in the woods, but a betrayal. He became convinced that one of us had killed her and was now trying to cover up the crime. As the tension between us grew, so did the strain on our already fragile mental state. Jake's accusations were absurd, but the more he voiced them, the harder it was to ignore the growing sense of dread. At night, we all lay awake in our tents, listening to the rustling of the trees, wondering if it was the wind or something else. It was a dangerous spiral, and Jake's behavior only intensified it. He started carrying extra weapons, convinced that the only way to survive was to defend ourselves from whatever was out there, and in his mind that meant being prepared for betrayal from within the group. Amidst the chaos, I tried to hold on to my rationality, but I couldn't escape the strange feeling that something was wrong with me too. I started noticing things I couldn't explain, visions at the edges of my sight, strange symbols carved into trees that weren't there before, and a growing sense that something was shifting beneath my skin. It wasn't just paranoia. It felt like something was growing inside me, something that didn't belong. It was like the forest was creeping into my bones, changing me, just as it had changed the others. The second subplot emerged when Mark, our most experienced guide, began to question his own role in our expedition. Mark had spent his life in the wilderness, had crossed paths with dangerous creatures, and survived countless expeditions. But even he wasn't immune to the increasing dread that gripped us all. He started to question whether we were simply victims of our own fear, or if something darker was truly at work. Mark's deepening doubts began to crack the fragile unity of the group. His rational mind, which had been the anchor for us in the beginning, now seemed more like a crutch. Every suggestion he made, every attempt to plan our next move, was met with resistance. It wasn't just the unknown in the forest that was tearing us apart. It was the growing mistrust among us. We couldn't agree on anything anymore. There were no clear answers, no way to escape this nightmare we had found ourselves trapped in. It was as if the very woods themselves had infected our minds. Meanwhile, a third subplot began to take shape, the supernatural element that we had all been trying to avoid acknowledging. The more time we spent in the forest, the more we realized that there was something inherently wrong with the place. It wasn't just the missing Sarah or the growls in the distance. It was the inexplicable phenomena that surrounded us. The trees seemed to move when we weren't looking, shadows lingered too long, and we began to hear voices, faint whispers just outside our hearing. It felt as though the forest itself was alive, that it was watching us, listening to our every thought. And perhaps the most terrifying part was that it was beginning to affect our dreams. For the first few nights, I had vivid nightmares that felt like memories, nightmares that blurred the lines between reality and fantasy. I dreamt of Sarah, standing at the edge of the woods, calling to me. Her voice was distorted, pleading, but there was something wrong about it. Her face was twisted, a grotesque version of the woman we had known. The whispers I heard in my dreams seemed to echo through the trees when I was awake. They weren't just in my mind anymore, they were real, and they were coming from the forest. The other members of the group were experiencing similar dreams, all of them centered around the forest itself. The trees seemed to come alive in our sleep, reaching out to us, pulling us into their grasp. I tried to shake off the thought, blaming the stress of the situation, but there was no escaping it. It was as if the forest had a consciousness of its own, one that had been waiting for us to come, waiting for us to lose ourselves in its embrace. In addition to the supernatural elements, we were also fighting the basic human need to survive. Our food and water supplies were running low, and the wilderness around us was starting to feel more like an insurmountable obstacle. Our bodies were weakening from the lack of nutrition and rest, but the emotional toll was even worse. It wasn't just the constant fear of being hunted, it was the mental exhaustion of never feeling safe, of never being able to relax. The paranoia that had started with Jake spread to the rest of the group. Mark's once calming presence now felt like a burden, and the distrust simmering beneath the surface reached its boiling point when we stumbled upon the site where Sarah's body should have been. It was a clearing, an eerie place marked by strange symbols and carvings on the trees, all arranged in a pattern that felt like a ritual. There was no sign of Sarah, only the remnants of what had happened to her, as though the forest had consumed her completely. It was a grim realization. We were no longer explorers, we were prey. The shadows in the trees seemed to grow darker, more sinister. And that is when we knew there was something in the woods, something that didn't just want us out. It wanted us dead. The forest, once an intriguing mystery, had become a suffocating, ever-present terror that gripped my every thought. The shadows grew longer with each passing day, and the unnatural chill in the air felt like a constant weight on my chest. I tried to keep moving forward, to push through the overwhelming sense of dread, but it became harder with each step. Every direction seemed to lead deeper into the heart of something ancient, something monstrous. It was on the 7th day, when the hunger and fatigue had begun to erode any semblance of rational thought, that the turning point arrived. It wasn't the discovery of more symbols, or the whispers that continued to plague our sleep. No, this moment came when the forest itself seemed to claim one of us entirely. It was Mark, our most experienced guide, who first crossed the line. He had been the one to keep us grounded, the one who had urged us to stay focused, to keep our minds sharp. But as the days dragged on, even his steel resolve began to crack. It started with small things, his constant scanning of the trees, the way his eyes darted from shadow to shadow, as though something was moving just beyond his sight. I didn't think much of it at first. We were all becoming paranoid after all. But then one night, Mark disappeared. It wasn't a gradual disappearance, nor was it a subtle one. One minute, Mark was sitting by the fire, his eyes dull and distant. The next, he was gone, vanished into the forest without a word. It happened so quickly that none of us had time to react. His pack, his gear, everything was left behind, as though he had simply walked off in the middle of the night, drawn by something we couldn't understand. We called out for him, our voices carrying through the trees, but there was no response. Only the wind carrying strange, eerie sounds, and the unnatural rustling of the branches. The forest had claimed him. Jake was the first to snap, screaming at the trees, accusing them of taking Mark. His wild, hysterical outburst only made everything worse. I tried to calm him, tried to remind him that we needed to stay together, but the terror had taken hold of him. That's when I noticed it, the faint whispering from the depths of the trees. It wasn't the wind this time. It was as though something was calling, beckoning us deeper into the forest, its voice unmistakable and maddening. I could feel it, too, the pull, the compulsion to follow. But I fought against it. "We need to find Mark," I said, my voice trembling despite my attempts to steady myself. "We need to stay together." But Jake, overcome by a madness I didn't understand, shook his head violently. "He's gone. He's not coming back. Don't you hear it? It's trying to make us follow. We have to leave. Now." It was then that I realized how much the forest had already begun to warp our minds. Mark's disappearance was no longer just a tragic event. It was a part of the puzzle we had all been unwilling to face. Something in this forest was hunting us, and it wasn't just some wild animal. It was something darker, more insidious, something ancient. In the chaos that followed Mark's disappearance, I heard it again, the whispers. They grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't ignore them any longer. They were too clear, too real. The voices spoke in languages I didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable. They were warning us, taunting us. And then, as if answering them, I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moved, shifting unnaturally between the trees. It wasn't human, too tall, too wide, and far too fluid in its movement. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to shout, to warn the others, but the words caught in my throat. I turned, but by the time I had gathered enough courage to speak, the shadow was gone. The reality of what we were dealing with hit me like a sledgehammer. This wasn't just a hunt, it was a game, and we were the prey. "Jake," I said, forcing myself to stay calm, though my voice cracked. "We need to move now. This isn't just some animal. Something is hunting us, and it's not going to stop until we're all gone." Jake, still babbling about Mark's fate, seemed oblivious to the gravity of the situation. He had already lost all sense of reason. It was clear now that his paranoia was consuming him, and I could see that he was about to snap. His wild eyes darted from tree to tree, his hand constantly twitching toward his rifle, as if he believed the answer to our survival lay in firepower alone. But I knew better now. Guns wouldn't save us here. As the night wore on, we stumbled through the woods, trying to find some sign of Mark, some hint of hope. But the forest was closing in around us, its oppressive weight almost unbearable. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if something was closing in. And then just when I thought I could take no more, I saw it again, the shadow looming between the trees, watching us. But this time, it wasn't alone. More shadows joined it, smaller, but just as twisted. Figures that didn't belong, moving with unnatural grace, their forms obscured by the underbrush. I knew, with bone-chilling certainty, that these were not animals. These were something else entirely, something old and wrong. Jake finally realized what was happening. His eyes went wide with terror as he slowly, reluctantly, turned to face me. "What is it? What the hell are they?" he whispered, barely able to form the words. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The truth was too much to bear. There was no explanation for what we were seeing, no rational answer. All I could do was run, to try and escape the nightmare that was closing in on us. But I knew deep down that it was too late. We were already too deep. There was no way out. The forest had claimed us, and now it was time to pay the price. The night following our encounter with the shadow figures was one of complete dread and despair. We had barely made it through the dense forest when we finally set up a makeshift camp in a small clearing, hoping against hope that the night would pass without further incident. But no matter how tightly I closed my eyes, sleep never came. Instead, I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the wind howling through the trees, and more disturbingly, the faint echoes of whispers just beyond the reach of comprehension. Jake had fallen into a kind of delirium, his mind clearly fracturing from the constant pressure of our situation. He mumbled to himself, speaking incoherently about Mark and the shadow figures, about things that didn't seem to make sense. He kept reaching for his rifle, as though a weapon could fend off the inevitable, but there was nothing to fight. Not really. Not when the forest itself was our enemy. I could feel it too, the weight of the place pressing down on us, every breath feeling heavier than the last. I knew we had to leave, but the forest was a labyrinth of twisted trees and shadows, and I had no sense of direction anymore. We were lost, completely consumed by the very thing we had come here to explore. I glanced over at Jake, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wild. He was no longer the man I had started this journey with. The once steady and reliable partner was now a shadow of himself, consumed by fear. "I can't stay here," Jake whispered, voice trembling. "We have to go. We can't just sit here. We need to run, to get out before it gets us too." But the thought of running was as terrifying as staying. The shadow figures had already shown themselves, and I had no doubt they were still watching, waiting for our next move. I knew then that whatever we were dealing with wasn't going to give us the mercy of simply letting us go. We had stumbled into something ancient, and it wasn't going to let us escape so easily. The next few hours were a blur of frantic movements, my mind racing with thoughts of escape, while Jake stumbled further into madness. He started pacing, muttering to himself, his eyes darting around the trees as though the very shadows themselves were closing in. His behavior became more erratic, and it was clear to me that if I didn't do something, he was going to break completely. "I need to find Mark," Jake said suddenly, his voice trembling. "He's still out there. He's still alive. I can feel him. We need to go find him." I wanted to argue, to stop him, but I could see the look in his eyes. There was nothing left of the man I knew. The terror had overtaken him completely. He was no longer thinking rationally. "Jake, we can't," I said softly, my voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Mark is gone. We need to focus on getting out of here before we become part of this place, too." But my words fell on deaf ears. In the next moment, Jake bolted into the trees, his steps quick and erratic as he disappeared into the shadows. I called after him, but it was no use. I knew deep down that I couldn't stop him, that the forest had already claimed him just as it had claimed Mark. I sat there, numb with disbelief, my heart pounding in my chest as I realized that I was now completely alone. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, pressing in on my mind as though they were trying to tear at my very soul. The shadows were closing in, and I knew it wasn't just Jake who had fallen victim to them. I too was on the verge of losing myself. The hours that followed were a blur of desperation and hopelessness. I tried to move, tried to find my way out, but the forest was an endless maze, and every path seemed to lead deeper into the heart of darkness. The whispering was constant now, filling my ears with unintelligible sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The air had grown thick, suffocating, as though the very earth itself was conspiring to trap me here. Then, in a moment of clarity, I realized that I wasn't alone. Something was with me, something that had been watching all along. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence, a weight in the air that pressed against my chest. My heart raced as I frantically scanned the trees, but there was nothing visible. Nothing but the relentless whispers and the feeling that the forest was closing in on me, suffocating me, drawing me into its depths. In a final act of desperation, I drew my knife and began cutting through the thick underbrush, praying for a way out. I didn't care about direction anymore. I didn't care about finding the others. I just needed to escape. But as I pushed forward, my strength faltered, and I stumbled to the ground, my body too tired to keep going. And then, for the first time since this nightmare began, I heard it. A voice. Clear. Real. It wasn't a whisper. "Help me," it said. I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was unmistakable, though faint. It was Mark. Or at least, it sounded like him. But I knew deep down that Mark was gone. Whatever was calling me wasn't him. It was the forest. It had become Mark's voice to lure me in, to lead me deeper into its trap. I had no choice but to continue, even as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I had come so far, lost so much. There was no turning back now. The forest had already taken everything from me. And as I walked deeper into the darkness, I understood the terrible truth. The forest was not just a place. It was a living entity, a force that fed on fear and madness, and it was determined to claim me, just as it had claimed Mark and Jake and anyone else who dared to venture too far into its depths. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the more I felt like I was being consumed by it. The weight of it pressed down on me, both physically and mentally, and I knew that if I didn't break free soon, I would become part of the shadows, just another whisper in the endless dark. But something inside me snapped that night. I realized that if I let the forest take me, I would be no better than the others who had succumbed before me. I had a choice, and for the first time in days, I made the decision to fight, to survive, no matter the cost. As I walked through the dense trees, the whispers intensified, twisting my thoughts and pulling at my sanity. But instead of letting the panic overtake me, I remembered something that had kept me grounded in the face of danger before. When I was a younger man, my father had taught me to always look for a way out, to never let the darkness swallow me whole. His lessons came rushing back now, like lifelines thrown into the storm. The first thing I did was stop moving. The instinct to run had kept me in motion, always afraid that the shadows would catch up to me. But I understood now that running only made me more vulnerable. The forest had already ensnared me, and as long as I kept running, it would keep dragging me deeper. So, I planted my feet and stood still, listening to the voice of the forest that had once been my greatest fear. The silence that followed was almost as overwhelming as the whispers. It felt like the forest itself had taken a breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I knew the creature, or whatever it was watching me, waiting for me to crack, to give in to my fear. But I wasn't going to let it. Not anymore. With the clarity that came from facing my own terror head-on, I took stock of my situation. The first step to regaining control was to shut out the noise. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing, slowing it down until I was no longer hearing the whispers, no longer feeling the invisible eyes that surrounded me. I let the world fall away for a moment and felt a strange calm descend upon me, something I hadn't experienced since the moment I first set foot in these cursed woods. Then, I started thinking logically. I needed to find a way out, not just physically, but mentally. I had to keep my mind sharp, or the forest would wear me down piece by piece. I needed to find a source of light, something to break through the oppressive darkness. I remembered my flashlight, still secured in my backpack, and reached for it. The light flickered on, small but bright, cutting through the shadows around me. The forest seemed to recoil from the beam. the shadows retreating just enough to make me feel like I was in control. The flashlight's light became my anchor, and I used it to guide myself through the forest. As I walked, I began to challenge the whispers, calling out into the trees. "I know what you are. I won't be your victim." At first, there was no answer. The whispers seemed to stop altogether, as though the forest itself was confused by my newfound resolve. I continued, walking with purpose, forcing myself to ignore the creeping doubts that threatened to cloud my thoughts. I knew that if I gave in to them, the forest would consume me, body and soul. Hours passed, and with each step, I could feel the pull of the forest weakening. It was as if the very essence of the place was growing tired of me, realizing that I wasn't as easy a prey as it had hoped. My senses sharpened, and I began to notice small details I had missed earlier. The rustling of leaves underfoot, the faint glow of the moon breaking through the canopy above. There was still a world outside the forest, a world that I belonged to, and I was determined to find my way back to it. But I knew I wasn't free yet. I still had the creature to face, the thing that had lured me deeper into this nightmare. It was close. I could feel it in my bones, like a cold breath on the back of my neck. The air grew heavy again, thick with the same oppressive energy that had nearly broken me. But I wasn't afraid. I was ready. I knew I had to confront it, whatever it was, before I could truly escape. I stopped and called out, "I know you're there. I won't let you control me anymore. If you want me, come and get me." The response was immediate, a low growl that reverberated through the trees. My heart pounded, but I stood my ground, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The growl was closer now, a sound like no animal I had ever heard. It was more of a deep, guttural hum, as if the forest itself was alive, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. And then, from the darkness, it appeared. It was a creature unlike anything I could have imagined, a hulking form, too large to be any known animal, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. It moved with an unnatural grace, its movements more like a shadow than a living thing. I could feel its malevolent presence, its hunger, but I didn't flinch. I held my ground, staring it down with everything I had. "You won't have me," I said, my voice steady despite the terror that gripped me. For a moment, nothing happened. The creature and I locked eyes, each of us sizing the other up. It was a battle of wills, a test to see who would falter first. And then, to my surprise, it stepped back, fading into the shadows, its growl dissipating into the night. I stood there for a long time, my breath ragged, but I had won. I had faced my fear and survived. In that moment, I understood something. The forest, the creature, it wasn't just an external force. It was a manifestation of my own fears, my own doubts. The moment I stopped running, stopped letting it control me, I had broken free. And as the sun began to rise, casting light over the trees, I knew that I had won. Not just the battle against the forest, but the battle within myself. I wasn't the same man who had entered those woods. I was stronger now, not because I had conquered the forest, but because I had conquered the darkness within me. And with that victory, I knew that I could face whatever came next. As the days passed, my mind began to unravel the truth. The forest had an ancient, consuming power, one that no one had ever been able to comprehend fully. There was something beyond the physical landscape, something alive in the very air, the trees, and the shadows. The strange whispers, the unnatural stillness, the sense of being watched, they were all signs that the forest itself was not just a collection of trees and animals, but a force, an entity, maybe even a sentient being. And I had awakened it. I had thought I was strong enough to walk through the wilderness, thinking I could conquer the unknown, just as I always had. But now it was clear. This place had a history, one that had been buried for centuries, and it was never meant to be disturbed. Something had been watching, something had been waiting. I wasn't the first to venture too deep. Others had come before me, lost souls who had tried and failed. But I wasn't going to let them be forgotten. The realization hit me with the force of a thunderclap. I wasn't just running from the darkness anymore. I was running toward something. I had to confront it. If I didn't, the forest would never let me go, and I would become just another whisper in its depths. That creature I had sensed in the shadows, the thing that had been following me, watching me, wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real. It had been feeding off my fear, and now it was time for me to stop being prey. I had to prepare myself, physically, emotionally, and mentally. My flashlight had been my first step, a lifeline in the darkness, but it wasn't enough. The forest would be more than just a place to escape. It would be a battleground. I started with my surroundings. The quiet had been unbearable for days, a suffocating silence that ate away at my thoughts. leaving me open to the forest's manipulation. The constant rustling of leaves, the whispering winds, they all felt like traps. But I knew now that I had to use everything in my environment, even the shadows, to my advantage. The trees that had once seemed ominous and suffocating now felt like potential allies. Every rock, every fallen branch was a weapon. I didn't need to fight with brute strength. I needed to fight with awareness, cunning, and strategy. The next step was mental preparation. I began to center myself, learning to block out the whispers and the gnawing sense of dread. My thoughts had been scattered, driven by the unrelenting fear the forest had instilled in me. Now I would train my mind to focus. I needed clarity. The fear would always be there, lurking in the corners of my mind, but I could control it. I had to. I closed my eyes and began to breathe deeply, channeling the same techniques I had learned as a child when I faced my fears. Back then, it was the dark corners of my house, the things that went bump in the night. Now, it was this, an ancient, malevolent force that seemed to bend the very fabric of nature itself. But I knew I could conquer it. I would not succumb. I would face it head on. I spent hours each day walking through the woods, retracing my steps, but this time, I walked with purpose. Each move was deliberate, controlled. I knew the creature, the thing that had been stalking me, was getting closer. I felt it in the air, in the weight of the trees, in the tension that coiled within the silence. It wasn't just watching me anymore. It was preparing for something, and I had to be ready for whatever came next. Every rustling sound in the distance, every flicker of movement in the shadows, made me stop, look, and listen. I was hunting the hunter now. The more I walked, the more I realized that I could hear the forest, the creaking of the ancient trees, the crackle of dry leaves beneath unseen feet. The forest was trying to communicate with me. I needed to listen. The creatures of this place were more than what I had thought. They were not just wild animals, but part of something larger, something far older. There was a moment, in the depths of my preparation, when I understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. The forest wasn't just home to some beast. It was the home of a cursed, ancient entity, one that had been silent for centuries, waiting for someone like me to stumble upon its boundaries. My presence had awoken it, and now it was coming for me. I had been too arrogant, too unaware of the gravity of my actions. But now it was too late to turn back. The creature was real, and it had no mercy. My strategy was simple: survive long enough to face it directly. I didn't know how, but I knew I would have to fight. I wasn't just trying to escape anymore. I had to face the creature that had tormented me for days, and I had to put an end to it before it could claim me. I couldn't trust my senses completely. This forest distorted everything, twisting the familiar into something unrecognizable. But I could trust my instincts. My gut had kept me alive this long, and I wouldn't let it down now. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ground. I knew that the creature would strike at night, just as it had done before. The forest was most dangerous when it was dark, when the shadows seemed to take form, and the whispers began again. I felt my pulse quicken, but I kept my breathing steady. I had to be calm. I had to be smart. I crouched low, ready to move quickly if I had to. The creature would come, and when it did, I would be waiting. The battle for my life was about to begin, and I was more prepared than ever before. Every part of me was focused on survival, every nerve sharpened and alert. This was the moment. The forest had tested me, twisted me, but it had not broken me. I was ready. As the hours stretched on, I could feel the weight of the forest settling around me. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of stillness that only happens just before a storm. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the shadows, which had once seemed like a threat, now felt like old friends. They were part of me now. I had walked these woods, mapped out every crevice in my mind, and every twisted tree was now a marker in the labyrinth that had become my battleground. The creature, I was certain now, was not just stalking me, it was toying with me, drawing me deeper into its web. But tonight, that would change. The creature was closer than ever. Its presence, like a dark cloud, loomed over me. I could feel it in my bones, the creeping sense of being watched. The whispers, which had once seemed like distant murmurs, were now a constant hum, just on the edge of my hearing. They were louder tonight, more insistent. I could hear them in the wind, in the rustling of the leaves, and in the creaking of the ancient trees. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew what they meant. It was calling to me. I hadn't slept in days, too fearful to rest. My mind, once clear and sharp, had begun to fray at the edges. Fatigue weighed on me like a stone, but I couldn't afford to let it get to me. I knew what was coming. The creature would strike under the cover of darkness, when my senses would be dulled and my body exhausted. It would take advantage of that. It had done so before, luring me into false security, but now I had one advantage it didn't expect. I knew it was coming. I had spent the last few hours preparing. The forest, which had once seemed like an impenetrable maze, was now my arena. I had mapped out every escape route in my mind, every trap that could be used to my advantage. The creature had shown itself to me in flashes, glimpses in the corner of my eye, but now I was ready for it to reveal itself fully. I had made a weapon out of whatever I could find in the forest. A jagged rock I'd sharpened, branches to use as spears, and some rope from my pack. They weren't much, but they would have to do. I had learned the forest's rhythm, the way the wind shifted, the way the shadows moved. I could almost predict the creature's next move. It wasn't just an animal, it was a force, something ancient that had been waiting for me to step into its domain. It knew the land as well as I did now, and that thought was both terrifying and empowering. This was no longer a fight for survival, it was a war. I was up against something far older than I could comprehend, and it had no mercy. But I wouldn't back down. The first step in my plan was to set the perimeter. I couldn't rely on my senses alone. The forest could distort them, bend them, and twist them into something else. So, I used what I had learned about its patterns. I found a clearing just off the path where I had noticed the creature's tracks earlier. There, I began to mark my territory with branches and stones. I had to make sure I wasn't just protecting myself from the creature. I had to outsmart it. If I could get it to underestimate me, I could gain the upper hand. I worked silently, carefully placing each branch where I knew it would be noticed. The goal wasn't to trap it physically, but to confuse it, to make it think I was in a different location. I'd learned that the creature reacted to movement, not sound. If I could get it to follow false tracks, I might be able to surprise it when it least expected it. While I worked, my mind kept drifting back to the things I had seen. The shape I had glimpsed in the shadows, the faint growl I'd heard echo through the trees. It wasn't just an animal. It was something else entirely. A part of me wanted to believe that it was just an animal, a predator doing what predators do. But the other part of me knew better. It had a presence, an intelligence that no animal could possess. It was calculating, it was deliberate, and it was getting closer. I set the final trap. A thick rope, tied to a tree and looped around a large branch, was my last resort. If the creature charged at me, I would trigger the trap. It wasn't foolproof, but it would slow it down long enough for me to get to safety. Or if I was lucky, it might be enough to incapacitate it long enough for me to deal the final blow. As I stood there, the last rays of light faded completely, and the forest fell into an unnatural silence. It was the kind of silence that sent a chill down your spine, the kind that makes every footstep sound like a thunderclap. I knew it was here. The creature had arrived. I moved into position, the cold air biting at my skin, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no turning back now. I had prepared for this moment, and I would face it head on. The creature had been hunting me for days, but tonight, it was my turn to hunt it. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. The plan was in motion. The creature would show itself soon, and when it did, I would be ready. This was it, the final confrontation. I was no longer just a victim of the forest. I was its equal, and I was ready to claim my victory. The silence was unbearable. My breath came out in shallow, ragged gasps as I crouched behind a thick tree, its bark rough against my skin. The air felt colder than ever, the weight of the forest pressing in on me like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the tension. I had set my traps, prepared my weapons, and now all I could do was wait. The first sound came as a low rustle in the underbrush, barely perceptible at first, but then it grew louder, closer. A twig snapped under the weight of something heavy, and I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature was close, closer than I had ever felt it before. It was circling me, stalking, testing the air. It knew I was there, but it didn't yet know where I was. It was too careful, too cautious. It was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I gripped the jagged rock in my hand, the sharp edges biting into my palm. It was my last line of defense, my only weapon in this battle. I had learned that the creature didn't rely on sheer force alone. It was cunning, smart, and it understood fear. But tonight, I would show it that I was not afraid. I had seen its tricks, felt its mind games, and now I knew how to fight back. The ground beneath me trembled as something large moved through the trees. I could feel the presence of it, a dark, oppressive energy that seemed to swallow the light. The shadows around me deepened, stretching unnaturally as the creature came closer. I had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, I felt the weight of everything that had led me to this point. Every step I had taken, every decision, had brought me to this clash in the heart of the wilderness. I could hear the creature's heavy breathing now, the low growl that reverberated through the trees like a distant thunderstorm. It wasn't just an animal, it was something more, something ancient and wild. I could feel its intelligence, its awareness, and I knew that if I hesitated for even a second, it would be the end for me. I could see its outline in the distance, a silhouette against the blackened forest. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs and glowing eyes that pierced the darkness. My body tensed, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The creature's gaze swept the area, its eyes flicking over the trees, scanning for any movement, any sign of me. I held my breath, remaining as still as possible. It passed within feet of me, its presence so close that I could feel the heat radiating off it. It was so close that I could hear its ragged breath and the subtle crunch of its claws against the forest floor. My pulse raced, and for a moment, everything inside me screamed to run. But I stayed. I had no choice. I had to face it. Suddenly, the creature's head snapped up, its eyes locking onto mine. For a split second, time seemed to slow. Its gaze was piercing, searching, and I knew in that instant that it had found me. It didn't roar, didn't growl. No, it simply stared, as if it had been waiting for this moment too. The air around us crackled with tension. I could hear my heartbeat, feel the blood rushing in my ears. Then, without warning, it lunged. I had only a moment to react. I whipped the rock up, aiming for its face, but it was faster than I had anticipated. It was upon me in an instant, its long arms reaching out, grasping at the air. The strength behind its limbs was unreal, and as it grabbed for me, I barely managed to duck and roll away, narrowly avoiding its claws. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, but the creature was already circling, its eyes never leaving me. The moment I stood, it lunged again, and this time, I wasn't fast enough. Its claws raked across my side, tearing through my jacket and skin. I screamed in pain, but I didn't stop. I couldn't let it win. I had come too far, faced too much, and now, it was my turn to fight back. I stumbled back, the pain in my side almost unbearable, but I refused to let it slow me down. I could see the trap up ahead, the rope tied to the tree. I knew that if I could just get to it, I could pull it tight, and it would slow the creature down, at least for a moment. But the creature was relentless, and it was closing in fast. With every ounce of strength I had left, I bolted toward the trap. The creature followed, its growls growing louder as it gained on me. I was so close. I reached for the rope, my fingers brushing it, and then I yanked with everything I had. The rope tightened, and with a deafening snap, it caught the creature's leg, sending it crashing to the ground. It howled in rage, struggling to free itself, but I wasn't done yet. I grabbed the sharp rock and rushed forward. The creature was disoriented, and I knew I had only seconds before it broke free. Without thinking, I plunged the rock into its side, aiming for its heart. It screeched in agony, its body convulsing as it tried to throw me off. But I didn't let go. I pushed harder, driving the rock deeper into its flesh. The creature's screams filled the air, loud and shrill, echoing through the trees. For a moment, I thought it would never end, that the beast would never stop fighting. But eventually, the screams died down, the creature's body going limp beneath me.